This is not a story about scandal. It is not a story about judgment. This is a story about patterns, the kind that quietly repeat themselves across decades, unnoticed, unchallenged, and eventually irreversible. Today's lecture is for a very specific group of people, those in their 40s and beyond, who feel an unexplainable fatigue in relationships, those in their 50s and 60s, who quietly wonder, why hasn't my life fundamentally changed? And especially those who have already experienced emotional disconnection, loneliness, or a sense of inner emptiness that no external stimulus seems to resolve. Let me be clear about the purpose of this talk. We are not here to analyze others. We are here to confront the repeating architecture of our own lives. The illusion of time as a healer. There is a common belief, especially in Western culture, that time stabilizes people. That as we age, we naturally become wiser, calmer, more grounded. But psychologically speaking, this is false. Time does not transform consciousness. It reinforces whatever structure already exists. If awareness does not change, then time does not heal. It deepens the pattern. So the real question is not, am I getting older? The real question is, am I evolving or simply repeating? The repetition mechanism. In both contemplative traditions and modern psychology, there is a shared insight. Human beings are not primarily driven by conscious choice. They are driven by conditioned loops. In clinical terms, what we often call addiction, including sexual behavioral. Addiction is not simply about desire. It is a neuropsychological loop composed of emotional deprivation, dopamine-based reward conditioning, reinforced neural pathways. This creates what we might call an automated behavioral circuit, which means people don't repeat behaviors because they lack willpower. They repeat behaviors because their brain has been trained to do so. Why it doesn't fade with age. Here is where many people misunderstand reality. They assume that behaviors, especially impulsive or addictive, ones naturally decline with age. But in many cases, the opposite occurs. Why? Because aging introduces three critical psychological pressures. 1. Increased loneliness. 2. Loss of identity roles, career, parenting, social relevance. 3. Emotional disconnection within long-term relationships. When these factors combine, the brain doesn't seek meaning. It seeks relief. And relief is often found in familiar reward systems. From pleasure to anxiety avoidance. In youth, behavioral addiction is typically pleasure-driven. But in later life, especially in the 60s and beyond, the structure shifts. It becomes not a pursuit of pleasure, but an avoidance of anxiety, emptiness, and existential fear. This is a critical transformation. The behavior is no longer about excitement. It becomes a psychological survival strategy. The fear of real intimacy. Now here is a paradox. Many individuals claim they want deep, meaningful relationships, but unconsciously they avoid them. Why? Because real intimacy requires exposure, emotional vulnerability, the risk of rejection, the possibility of being truly seen. So instead, the mind chooses something else. Controlled stimulation, predictable interactions, shallow but manageable connections. In other words, people often reject authentic connection in favor of controllable experiences. The split self. By the time individuals reach their 60s within this pattern, a distinct psychological structure emerges. 1. Emotional detachment. Relationships continue, but without emotional depth. 2. Dual identity. Externally stable, composed, socially appropriate. Internally, still driven by hidden cycles of stimulation and escape. 3. Rationalization. Common internal narratives include, this is normal. At my age, this is acceptable. Everyone lives like this anyway. This is not honesty. It is cognitive dissonance management, the structure of long-term relationships. At this stage, relationships tend to fall into three predictable patterns. 1. Functional, but emotionally dead. The marriage remains intact, but only structurally. 2. Double life system. External behaviors continue, hidden beneath a stable surface. 3. Repeating conflict cycle. suspicion, conflict, temporary calm, repetition. In all three cases, the core issue is the same: the absence of genuine emotional connection. The final trajectories. As time progresses into the 70s and beyond, these patterns tend to converge into three outcomes. 1. Isolation collapse. Emotional disconnection from spouse. Estrangement from children. Social withdrawal. Result: chronic emptiness, depression, identity erosion. 2. Low energy repetition. The behavior doesn't disappear, it simply weakens, but the pattern remains. Result: a life that continues without depth or transformation. 3. Late awakening rare. A small minority, perhaps 10–20%, reach a point of recognition. They begin to see the pattern, the repetition, their own role within it. But this path requires something extremely difficult: radical self-confrontation. Why change is so difficult? Let's be precise. Change is not difficult because of the behavior itself. It is difficult because of three structural barriers. 1. Neural fixation. Repeated behaviors become automatic responses. 2. Lack of alternative rewards. There is nothing meaningful to replace the pattern. 3. Avoidance of self-awareness. People prefer explanation over confrontation. The core insight. At this point, everything reduces to one principle. The problem is not the behavior. The problem is the structure that produces the behavior. That structure looks like this: emptiness, stimulation, temporary relief. Emptiness. And unless this loop is broken, life does not change. It simply repeats. The most important question. So now, I leave you with a single question. Are you living reality? Or are you repeating a pattern you no longer question? Because most people do not confuse illusion with reality. They live inside it, the beginning of change. Real change does not begin with discipline. It begins with three recognitions: acknowledging your own emptiness, recognizing your own repetition, accepting your own responsibility. And this is the hardest part: not escaping discomfort, but facing it directly. If today's lecture challenged you even slightly, then something important has already begun. Because discomfort is not a problem. It is often the entry point of transformation. If this perspective gave you clarity, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing, so this conversation can reach others who may be quietly repeating the same patterns. In the next lecture, we will go deeper, not into the outcome, but into the origin. How early childhood attachment, emotional deprivation, and developmental conditioning shape the very patterns we struggle to escape. Because once you understand where it begins, you finally gain the ability to change where it leads.